5-minute tax guides from your 5-minute tax guy. Short lessons to help you navigate the treacherous, hazardous, and totally unpredictable U.S. federal tax code. American Opportunity Credit. There are two education credits available, the American Opportunity Credit and the Lifetime Learning Credit. We will first cover the general requirements to claim an educational credit, and then we will go into more detail for the American Opportunity Credit. The Lifetime Learning Credit will be covered in another video. You may be able to claim an education credit if you, your spouse, or a dependent you claim on your tax return was a student enrolled at or attending an eligible educational institution, and you or someone else had any out-of-pocket qualified educational expenses that was paid to an eligible education institution. What is an eligible educational institution? An eligible educational institution is generally any college, university, vocational school, or other post-secondary educational institution eligible to participate in a student aid program administered by the U.S. Department of Education. Virtually all accredited public, nonprofit, and proprietary or privately owned profit-making post-secondary institutions meet this definition. The educational institution should be able to tell you if it is an eligible educational institution. Certain educational institutions located outside the United States also participate in the U.S. Department of Education's federal student aid programs. Who can claim a student's expenses? If an exemption is allowed, or would be allowed prior to the 2018 tax year, for any person who claims the student as a dependent, all qualified education expenses of the student are treated as having been paid by that person. Therefore, only that person can claim an education credit for the student. If a student is not claimed as a dependent on another person's tax return, only that student can claim a credit. Expenses paid by a third party. Qualified education expenses paid on behalf of the student by someone other than the student, such as a relative, are treated as paid by the student. However, qualified education expenses paid or treated as paid by a student who is claimed as a dependent on your tax return are treated as paid by you. Therefore, you are treated as having paid expenses that were paid by the third party. Who cannot claim a credit? You can't claim an education credit if any of the following apply. If you didn't have a Social Security number or individual taxpayer identification number by the due date of the return, including extensions, you can't claim the American Opportunity Credit on either your original or an amended return if you later get an ITIN or Social Security number. You cannot claim another tax benefit using the same educational expenses. Your filing status is married filing separate. You are claimed as a dependent on another person's tax return, such as your parents' return. You or your spouse, if you're filing jointly, were a non-resident alien for any part of the tax year, and the non-resident alien did not elect to be treated as a resident alien for tax purposes. Your MAGI, or a modified adjusted gross income, is above the threshold for your filing status. The MAGI limits are as follows: $180,000 or more if married filing jointly, or $90,000 or more if single, head of household, or qualifying widow. MAGI is generally your adjusted gross income, but for some taxpayers that number may be adjusted by certain other items, such as foreign income, foreign housing deductions, student loan deductions, IRA contribution deductions, and deductions for higher education costs. What are qualified education expenses? Generally, qualified education expenses are amounts paid for tuition and fees required for the student's enrollment or attendance at an eligible educational institution. It doesn't matter whether the expenses were paid in cash, check, credit card, debit card, or with borrowed funds, such as a student loan. For course-related books, supplies, and equipment, only certain expenses qualify for the American Opportunity Credit. Qualified education expenses include amounts spent on books, supplies, and equipment needed for a course of study, whether or not the materials are purchased from the educational institution as a condition of enrollment or attendance. Qualified education expenses include non-academic fees, such as student activity fees, athletic fees, or other expenses unrelated to the academic course of instruction, only if the fee must be paid to the institution as a condition of enrollment or attendance. However, fees for personal expenses described later are never qualified education expenses. What are not qualified education expenses? Qualified education expenses for either credit do not include amounts paid for the following: personal expenses, this means room and board, insurance, medical expenses including student health fees, transportation, and other similar personal, living, or family expenses. Qualified education expenses for either credit do not include amounts paid for the following: any course or other education involving sports, games, or hobbies, or any non-credit course unless such course or other education is part of the student's degree program. If you or the student takes a deduction for higher education expenses, such as on a Schedule A or Schedule C, you can't use those expenses in your qualified education expenses when figuring your education credits. Also, qualified education expenses must be reduced by any tax-free educational assistance received, usually shown on the Form 1098-T, explained later. No double benefit allowed. You can't do any of the following: deduct higher education expenses on your income tax return, as for example a business expense, and also claim an education credit based on those same expenses. Claim more than one education credit based on the same qualified education expenses. Claim an education credit based on qualified education expenses paid with educational assistance, such as a tax-free scholarship, grant, or employer-provided educational assistance. The chart on the right can help you determine if you qualify for an education credit. The chart can be found in IRS Publication 17, and you can find that publication by searching Google for Pub 17. One important step that the IRS left off this chart: if you are convicted of a felony for possessing or distributing a controlled substance, then you are not eligible to take the credit. Items related specifically to the American Opportunity Credit. The American Opportunity Credit can only be claimed for expenses for the first 4 years of post-secondary education. It cannot be claimed for graduate-level education expenses. It is a tax credit of up to $2,500 of the cost of tuition, fees, and course materials paid during the year. 40% of the credit, or up to $1,000, is refundable. The amount of the credit is 100% of the first $2,000 plus 25% of the next $2,000 paid during the taxable year for tuition, fees, and course materials. The student must not have been convicted of a felony for possession of or distributing a controlled substance. This chart shows the differences between the AOC and the Lifetime Learning Credit. The school should provide to the student a Form 1098-T, which shows information required for the credits and must be filed with the tax return to claim the credit. Important information on the form includes the school's name, address, and EIN number, amounts paid for tuition and fees, half-time status, graduate student status, and scholarships received. The credit is claimed by completing Form 8863. The wonderful thing about this credit is that since it's a refundable credit, you can receive a tax refund even if you have no income or deductions, and even if you're not required to file a return. 40% of the potential $2,500 is refundable, so that means that you can receive as much as $1,000 back as a refund even if you have no income. That's it for this session. Thanks for watching the video. For more great 5-minute tax guides, check out the other videos in my 5-minute tax guide video series. See the list in the description below this video.